name is Beth Marcellus. I am the lead instructional designer at the Education and Technology Innovation Support Office at USIS, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Brown Bag on creating first-rate rubrics. Our speakers today are Simone Fari from the ETI and Linda McCauley from the ETI.
Goals for this session today are that the participants will be able to define what a rubric is, differentiate between checklist, holistic, and analytic rubrics, identify the three components of an analytic rubric, describe at least two benefits for instructors and another two benefits for students. Around for a definition and to go out to find one that I like. A rubric is typically an evaluation tool or set of guidelines used to promote consistent application of learning expectations, learning objectives, or learning standards in the classroom, or to measure their attainment against a consistent set of criteria. And this came from the Glossary of Education Reform. The reason that this definition I thought was the best is because of the words that I highlighted. The first is evaluation, as a reminder that a rubric can be a really important tool in your evaluation toolkit. It uses the word consistent not just once, but twice. And rubrics ensure consistency across the educational experience for a number of reasons that we'll discuss in the presentation. They highlight learning expectations, learning objectives, or learning standards. And this is important because those are your guide stars to creating high-quality rubrics. And finally, they use the word measure because rubrics are an excellent way to help you measure in precise and meaningful ways the accomplishments of your students. We see rubrics used on papers. We see them on projects, oral presentations, group discussions, class participation, portfolios, and really any assignment that is assessed. Now, there are basically three types of rubric: checklist, holistic, and analytic. The slide is structured so you go from simplest, the checklist, to the most complex, the analytic. We found in our research that the most complex is also the most useful. So we are going to focus the majority of this presentation on analytic rubrics, but we'll give you a brief overview of checklist and holistics because they can also be useful tools in certain situations. So not even everyone mentions checklist when they talk about rubrics, and certainly we're not talking about the kind of checklist you might use when you pack everything for vacation, but we got a definition from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality that we thought was useful in the educational context. And they said that it's a form that is used for quickly and easily recording data or identifying actions or requirements. The advantages of a checklist are right there in that definition. It can be quick and easy to design it, and it can be quick and easy to use it. However, the disadvantages, because of that, you don't have as much detail in this information for you and for the student that you might want. Quick example of a checklist here. And throughout this presentation, for the most part, we're going to refer to rubrics that might be used to evaluate a paper. So in this case, if somebody was using a checklist to evaluate a paper, it would either have three sources, yes or no, correct AP style, yes or no. So there's always a binary choice in a checklist: yes, no, complete, incomplete, proficient, not proficient, whatever. The next type of rubric is the holistic rubric, and that uses a single scale. One score, one letter, one number, one description is all they get, with all the criteria then being considered and graded with this one mark. Some people might refer to this as a grade sheet. That's the same thing. And these also can be quicker to score and usually don't involve comments or corrections, and so efficient for large group scoring. And they do give a summary of student achievement. However, they can have a high degree of subjectivity and may be difficult to decide on what score, what bucket your student work falls in. And they also don't provide the detailed information that students need. They get a middle or lower grade. What caused that? It could have been a variety of things. They also might not know what they did well. They don't know whether maybe it was the content, maybe it was the quality there. It leaves a lot of questions for the students. The reason I bring up what they do well is because we actually did a webinar on what's called a strength-based approach. It's called Figuring Out What Works and Doing More of It. And we want to highlight that your rubric can not only show you gaps in performance that need to be addressed, but also what the student is already doing well and what you are doing well as a teacher, and that way you can do more of that. I have a friend, and for years she was a judge at the county fair judging baked goods. We always thought that this was like the dream volunteer job. And she says, no, actually, a lot of people don't bake as well as they think they do. And I had to eat a lot of baked goods that were really not very good at all. So this was the rubric we found, one that somebody in such a position might use for chocolate chip cookie. In this case, that is high scoring, gets the 3. It would have a perfectly balanced taste, no dry spots, evenly distributed chocolate chips, well blended ingredients, evenly cooked, no burning, no undercooking. One that rates 2 is a little too sweet or salty, some dry spots. Chips and greens mostly evenly distributed, slightly burnt on edges or undercooked in the middle. And 1 overpowers in sweet or salty taste. It's dry, the ingredients and chips are not evenly distributed. It's raw or burnt in large portions. Now, if my friend wanted to pass on the job of cookie judge to you, would you find this holistic rubric useful for that role? Some sort of rubric is better than not. Absolutely. But let's talk a little bit more about the subjectivity of this. For instance, what would you do if the cookie met all of the attributes of a 3, with no dry spots, perfectly distributed chips, all that, but it was really salty? That would be an example, because when you have all these different things going on, where is it going to fall if it doesn't have every single quality? That is the risk, subjectivity, but it still can be a tool, and there's a place for it for sure. So now let's dive into the analytic rubric, which is well written, can be the least subjective and the most useful. It has at least 2 criteria. It has multiple performance levels and separate scores, and it's structured in a grid. It has 3 components, which we're going to give you a quick overview of and then dive into the specifics of them. The first is the criteria. They are usually a column on the left, and they show the elements that are going to be evaluated. And the next one is what we call the levels of performance, and that's usually a row on the top, and that indicates the range of possible accomplishment. Lastly, we have what are called performance level descriptors, and those are the cells in your grid, and they explain with the most specificity what's involved in meeting each of those levels of performance for each of the criteria. So now let's talk more about criteria. Like I said, it's typically on the leftmost column. Might be referred to as dimensions or categories, but for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to call it criteria. There should be at least 2, but you don't want too many. You want to limit yourself to the ones that are most important, what you really care about. And how do you know what you really care about? It's what's going to map to the objectives and the domains that you're assessing. More about that later. Continuing the analogy of a well-written paper, here are some criteria that you might look at. Quality of information, sources, mechanics, diagrams, and illustrations.
So during our presentation today, we will share some pro tips with you, and here's our first one. It is critical for ease of use to make sure that you have only 1 element per row. So when you are writing those criteria, make sure it is not double-barreled so that it is easier to determine the level of performance for that item. So let's practice that. If this was a row in someone's rubric about a research paper, what might be problematic about the criteria, current references in APA, and how it is worded once you actually have to use this rubric to grade a student submission? What do you notice that might cause problems with that criteria, current references in APA? Student does have current references, but they're not cited in proper APA, or vice versa. What do you do? Which performance level do you click or choose? What does current mean? Your definition of current might be very different than the definition your students have, so that is important to define clearly. Is it within 10 years, 5 years, 2 years? You need to make sure that that information is included in the performance criteria that you put in your rubric, and we will be talking more about that in a little bit. So here now you see what an example might be to split that out into 2 separate criteria, so it's not double-barreled. And then, of course, which we haven't talked about yet, the definition of current, or what version of APA would need to be either identified here or in the cells of the rubric under the criteria details, which we didn't fill in here, and just for the purposes of the example.
So now we're going to look more at the levels of performance, which is that scale on the top row. Usually, it doesn't have to be there. And it's a spectrum or a scale and it differentiates between who has exceeded, who has mastered, or not yet met the criteria. It's usually from lowest to highest. However, you might see it from highest to lowest, for instance, in Canvas. These can be done various ways, such as by icons like stars, by numbers, by letters, by a kind of scoring range like this, or by words or descriptions. But they should be mutually exclusive. They should be measurably different. They should be evenly distributed. They should have a lowest one that is an unacceptable level of performance and a top that really exemplifies excellence so that the student has something to aim towards, and at least one that is good enough. And I would also recommend that you think, if you're using words or descriptions, ones that will be motivating to your students and not demotivating. And you know your students better than we do. For instance, if I rate poor at something, I might feel a little discouraged by that. Whereas if you say that I'm emerging or needs improvement, that seems like something I'm capable of fixing.
This pro tip is to avoid the middle. And so when you think about how many performance levels should you have in your rubric, and many will recommend 3 to 5 performance levels, but you may have noticed that in all of our examples so far today, we've pretty much had 4 performance levels. And that is because there is something called the middle category responding bias. And if we use an even number of performance levels, we don't have a middle. So you can avoid that. And so we do recommend an even number of levels so that you can avoid the middle.
So now let's talk about the performance level descriptors. And those are the cells where the most detailed information is going to be given about how to score and how to meet those particular performance levels for the criteria. The analytic rubrics are most in-depth and thorough because those descriptors are detailed and precise. They show consistent measurements, clear scoring. They have clearly expressed standards for what needs to be done, and they have logically and evenly spaced gradations between them. So now let's look at one that does have scoring and has this precision. Back to the paper example, the student is being asked to identify the main issues. If they have identified none of these main issues in a case study, for instance, they get 0 and are rated as not met. If they identify 1 or 2, they get 1 point and are rated basic. If they identify 3 or 4, they get rated proficient and get 2 points. And if they get all 5 of the main issues, they get 3 points and are advanced. So not met is the default in Canvas, and that's why it's here. So we have 4, and we have 4 for a reason. We have one that shows someone who's really not met the mark at all. We have a basic level, someone who's approaching mastery but not there yet. We have one who has solid performance or proficiency, and we have one who's advanced or has completely mastered it. So basically 2 are showing not mastered and 2 are showing mastery. And now for a tip from Linda.
We mentioned this briefly earlier, but we want to circle back to it because it is so important. Good objectives make good evaluations. So by making your rubric align to your objectives and making sure that your objectives are written clear, precise, detailed, and measurable, that just sets you on a path to make your rubric more specific as well. By spending the time to align your objectives with the details of your rubric, it'll be more clear to your students and to you what you are looking to assess, and it will help you basically map back and prove that the students have met the objectives for that lesson or that course. So here's another chance for us to look at a piece of a rubric and see what we would do to improve the criteria and the performance level descriptors that you see here. So what could be better about the portion of the rubric that we see? So we're definitely pointing out the word choice here. What is considered acceptable? What does that exactly mean? Or what's expected? The idea of reducing to 4 categories to keep us from that middle level bias, because there won't be a middle then. Praise from others. Yeah, how are we going to know that? To assess that. They're being, praised from others or other employees, unless we have another means of gathering that data. For sure. The praise from others is different from the other criteria. So there's kind of a mismatch. The levels don't progress logically and reasonably from one to the other. It kind of changes up as they go through the scale as well. Not everything here is objective, right? It's a very subjective thing. How does one person define professionalism versus another? We need to be more specific, because otherwise it's a lot of work for the student to figure out what you're looking for and try to meet the mark. And it is definitely difficult for you to grade somebody with this descriptor as written, because it might be a mismatch from what you think versus what the student is trying to do. So we have a few more tips for you. This one is that every performance level doesn't have to be used. So maybe one of the problems with that previous one we were looking at is that it was impossible to split professionalism up into 4 or 5 different levels. So you may find, like in this example, that there isn't really a logical way to split up the levels, and so you may not use them all. So in this case, this happens to be an example from a rubric about analyzing the quality of an analytic rubric. So we mentioned that the number of performance criteria for an analytic rubric should be 2 or more. So if you have that, you're proficient. That's it. And if you don't, if you only have 1, then it would need improvement. So we didn't need to fill in the developing or mastery, because there really wasn't other levels there. It is totally okay to do that. If there really are only fewer options, absolutely do this. As a side note, if you use a rubric tool inside a learning management system like Canvas, for example, you don't actually have to leave the blank cells there. They will let you just fill in 2 criteria for that particular row in your rubric. So you'll just enter those and that's it. And then also think about how your criteria can be weighted differently. We do this because we don't want things that are less important to have the same weight in a rubric as something that's more critical. So in the example here, you can see that having the number of performance criteria is only worth a maximum of 5 points, but each criteria contains only 1 element to evaluate we feel is more important, more critical, so that is worth 15 points. And you can certainly do that. So when you think about your rubric design, if there's something you want to assess, but you don't want it to have as much weight as other criteria, totally adjust the points possible for those items to reflect the importance of the item to the students. And now we have an activity again for you to look at this example from a rubric. And for formatting of the slide, we placed the criteria at the top. So the criteria is literature, research, and review, majority, at least 60% or higher of articles, and our references must be current, 15%. That's the criteria for this particular row in a rubric, and then our levels are there for the criteria indicators. So what are your thoughts on what we could do to improve this, particularly about the criteria or the components, or even the performance levels that you see? Anything you notice that you would improve? We don't have a descriptor for the levels like mastery or developing, so you could add that. That would make it more specific and perhaps more clear to the students. Double-barreled criteria. Yes, issues with needing more rows on this rubric to be able to assess clearly, because I wouldn't know where to begin trying to separate out all of those pieces if I kept them all together to be able to score the students. And where do the associations come from in the performance levels? Don't know. because it's very unclear language, right? We don't know what we mean by that. And as we mentioned in a previous example, what does current mean? So when you look at the details, how do we know that references are current? We can come back to that same example as before. The percentage weight thing that's up in the criteria about the 60% or higher and then that 15%, I don't know what that means. And I don't know how it transfers into my final grade when it says that each of the levels have a certain number of points possible. So that's very confusing to me as the person who's reading this rubric. And then to reflect back on the tip we just shared, perhaps currency of references shouldn't be worth the same amount of points as the actual literature research and review, right? So maybe that's the crux of this assignment, that you want them to do the literature review, and you don't want to give that the same amount of points as if they can check the box that they were all in the last 3 years or something. So you may, when you split them off into different rows, you also may want to adjust the points possible. This rubric is super confusing and definitely needs some revision.
And one more little point is that their distribution is 5 and 3 and then 2 and then 0. So not quite totally level gradation between those 4 categories.
So as we think about using rubrics for our teaching, the other thing we need to think about is the availability of that rubric to the student. So once you create that rubric, what's the best practice for providing it to your students? And the key best practice is that it is shared with students when they are given the assignment. So they have it from day 1. And then it is actually used by you, the evaluator or the instructor, to assess their work when they hand that assignment in. And the completed rubric is then given back to the student after you assess them so that they can see how they did. And then to take that availability piece a step further, the best practice for making sure the rubric is actually in your course, it's available to the students right with the assignment. So if you're using an LMS like Canvas, the rubric would be attached to the assignment via the rubric tool in the learning management system. So it's automatically visible to the students right with the assignment details. If you're not using a learning management system, you can still meet the mark of best practice by giving the students the rubric at the same time with the assignment, whether you printed it out on paper or you sent it as an attachment in a different system that you might have access to. You're going to provide that rubric with the assignment at the same time that you provide the information to the students. So you're not putting the rubric in the modules as a file attachment. You're not just putting it as a page in your syllabus. You are literally giving the details of the rubric to your students at the exact same place and time that you give them the assignment.
So we think there's a lot of advantages to using rubrics. Efficiency. So yes, it will take you some time to develop a rubric, but once you do, it can make your work much more efficient as you grade. Consistency reduces subjectivity. And with the same training, different reviewers will even come up with similar results in a well-written rubric. And that's one indication of a gold standard rubric. It shows strengths, like I said before, strengths of you as a teacher and your students as learners. It also shows room for improvement. It reduces your need to explain to the students, and it helps you align with colleagues. So if you work with your colleagues on rubrics, it helps you develop a common framework and language for assessing the content that you're teaching, really sharing expectations, standards about what students do. So we like to say that a well-written rubric is going to help the students hit the bullseye. And how do you think that helps the students from their perspective? Students know what is expected in the assignment. Expectations are clear. So I think from the faculty and the student's perspective, fewer questions are better, right? Student probably also doesn't want to have to spend time asking you questions about what's expected or what they need to do. And then they have a greater awareness of how their learning process is happening in this class, and then the progress they're making as well. And then that lead, I think, to improved work, right? They know what to do, and it's less stressful for them to actually figure out what to do. They can focus on doing quality work. And they can know how well they're doing and what they need to focus on. Now that we've talked about these advantages, hopefully that's inspired you to want to make your own rubric or improve rubrics you're already using. Let's talk next about the actual process that you might use. The first step, you'll have to determine your purpose, both of the assignment and what you're trying to assess there, the purpose of your assessment. To figure out what kind of rubric to use, you should then define your criteria, design your rating scale, write those performance descriptors, and you make your rubric itself, and then you evaluate your rubric and rinse and repeat, repeat 1 through 7. And that's the reason that we chose the particular icon that we did in this slide, is because it's an iterative process. And Linda will go into more detail about that. But don't think of this as a one and done.
So our next pro tip for you is, if you are going to use rubrics for your assignments and you do have access to a learning management system, don't actually start this process by writing it in the learning management system. You might be inclined to do it by hand and write it out on a piece of paper, but we would actually recommend to use a Google Doc in a spreadsheet or a table, so that you actually can do those edits and go through the iterative process of designing your rubric more easily, because it's a real pain in the neck to make those edits and move things around in the learning management system rubric tool, because editing is just limited there, and quite honestly is lots of clicks. So we do recommend to start this process on a document of sorts, some kind of electronic document, and then when you're done and you've gone through the process and made sure it's in good shape, then you can copy paste that content into your learning management system rubric tool if you have that available to you.
I'd like to give a few warnings. I know it would be tempting to go online and see what kind of tools can help you make your rubric, and there may be a place for that. They may be okay as starting points. Generative AI, such as ChatGPT, can spit out a rubric for you. There are rubric generators that can also do that. And there are even rubric banks, but they all can be problematic. First of all, these tools might not be approved by your organization, and you need to be very mindful about putting any sort of sensitive or proprietary information in them. The results for ChatGPT can really vary depending what kind of prompts or information you get, and we've seen some really substandard rubrics created by it. The rubric generators we cannot vouch for as well. I think there's an analogy between the rubric ranks and the cookies that people submitted to my friend at the county fair. Is not everyone bakes the kind of cookies they think they bake, and not everyone creates a kind of rubric of the quality they think. Just because somebody has put their rubric in a rubric bank doesn't mean it's a great rubric or necessarily a suitable rubric for your purposes. So in all these cases, consider these as starting points only.
And then we want to make sure that you evaluate the accuracy and alignment for consistency of scoring. So remember, rubric writing is an iterative process. And once you make a revision, you may think you've got everything done and it's all perfect, but then you test it with some actual student submissions, and inevitably you find that it needs some adjustment and improvement, but you will get closer to a polished final version through the steps of copy editing, then peer review, then testing it on some student work. You might actually want to grab some of the submissions from last year's assignment, for example, and test it out. And then the gold standard would be norm the rubric with other faculty. So what is norming? I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this. You can take full workshops on this, but as we said, if you try to get other faculty to look at your rubric, and better yet, see if they can actually participate in a norming session and score student submissions with a rubric that you've created, you will then have the highest level of evaluation and ensure that consistency and fair assessment that we've been talking about as so important and a benefit of using rubrics. If you go through the process of norming, you're going to have a facilitator that kind of manages the conversation between the people who are working together. Then you will grab copies of student work that exemplify each level of mastery that you have to assess, and then you will have your rubric. And the group of people, the faculty, the facilitator is working with, will actually score those student submissions based on that rubric, and you are looking for consistency. So if 3 or 4, 10 people, however many people you can get, look at the same submission and give it the same score, you are likely then hitting a good design of your rubric. But if they don't, then you need to discuss and debate and change and edit your rubric so that it is clear. So if we started with some of those examples we had earlier today and we realized, wait, you gave that a 2, I gave it a 4, we didn't understand what words meant, then you go through and you change it until you can assess a body of student submissions consistently across evaluators, and that you agree on like what a 2 is or what a 4 is or whatever the item is that you're looking at that moment. That then will get you the best rubric and the best results and the most consistent scoring. And because of this, of course, you're going to regularly revise. Even the best rubric, a rubric that was normed, will still need adjusting once you actually use it. I don't think I have ever used the exact same rubric from one year to the next when I've been teaching, because there's always a submission that some student submits that makes me rethink a particular performance criteria on the way it's worded in some way every year. So every year I make changes. And honestly, that is going to get you the best results if you're willing to iterate over time based on the work that students are submitting. So for those of you that are using Canvas, we are going to just do a real quick couple minutes overview of the basics of the Canvas rubric tool. You can use Canvas rubrics on assignments, discussions, and even on quizzes too, if you'd like. And there are some options that you can enable that allows your work to be a lot more efficient. So most LMSs have a rubric tool, so even if you're not using Canvas, you can use this. And the benefit really is if you put it in the Learning Management System rubric tool, you can calculate the score automatically and you don't have to add them yourself. But I do want to give you some tips if you are using the Canvas rubric tool, that if you want the grade to automatically appear in SpeedGrader, you need to make sure you check the rubric options and that you check the box, use this rubric for assignment grading. That's probably the #1 ticket I get about rubrics from Canvas, is that they do the rubric, they score it, and then the score is not going in the box for the grade, and that is because they forgot to check that. So make sure you do that if you want the grade to appear. If you're using the rubric tool, once you go through and you click all the boxes of what the score should be for the student, make sure that you click the save button that's directly below the rubric, because that way you will save it and all your scores and comments and everything you've written then will be given to the student for them to review. If you forget to click the save button, you don't provide any feedback to the student. It's sitting there in kind of a draft mode, and if you go on to the next student, you lose your work and have to start again. So make sure to click save. And also, this is just a reminder, you can kind of see here on the screenshot that the performance levels in Canvas go from highest to lowest. So on the left side is the best score, and on the right side is the worst score. So keep that in mind as you're designing.
Next, we'll show you our references. All of these icons that were used to develop this presentation come from a website called the Noun Project. They're in the Creative Commons as long as you attribute them. So we are doing that here. And so this is our internet site. I encourage you to check it out and see all the things that we do.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.